So the city of San Jose had a city council meeting yesterday. It was an interesting event. They're usually held once a week, but in this case, this will be the last one for a couple of weeks. And what you notice is that the politicians are just figureheads for city staff. In other words, the city staff, whether it's the lawyers drafting proposals or just whether it's just getting information that helps determine cost allocations, in this case between the county and the city regarding homeless housing. For the most part, these politicians are in some sense like judges. They get a memo, they are not necessarily vested in the outcome, and they are the representative of unions or some larger force that's behind them that's gotten them into that position. And that makes sense today simply because of how much money it costs in order to even attain or win a local election in a large city. And of course, it's also the reason why we don't have any Jimmy Carters or Bernie Sanders, at least not new ones, because all of those people got their start in local politics. And even when Jimmy Carter was running for president, it was the amount that he spent was laughably small compared to today's standards, where Biden won, but he had an additional almost $1 billion more if you count one of his allies' political donations as part of his war chest. You're looking at, again, billions of dollars as opposed to millions. And this became very apparent because one of the better council members, I believe her name is Pam Foley, she delivered one of the best speeches in support of proposals regarding cannabis storefront legislations. In other words, increasing the cap on cannabis stores. And she made a lot of, what appeared to be, just spontaneous remarks about, regulating marijuana dispensers in the same way that we regulate alcohol licenses. In other words, they are a controlled permit situation and given to people who are trustworthy and who have some form of training to ensure that, don't sell it to anybody over the age of 21, watch out for fake IDs, make sure you get the right equipment, etc. Well, the same standard is being applied here. And what I liked about Foley is that, she at one point says, I'm going over my talking points. I sound like an expert on this, but I'm really not. And, what was really interesting about her is that she managed to get consensus with another very, very good councilwoman whose name is Maya Esparza. And Maya was opposed to an uncapped situation that would potentially increase the number of cannabis dispensaries within her district, which was already, according to her, heavily saturated with the existing number of allowed businesses. And so within the course of the discussion, Foley decided to just exempt District 7, Maya's district, from new storefronts. And it worked. She got Maya's consensus and the legislation was passed. Or at least the proposal was passed. And, and now we've got a situation where obviously, again, more staff members have to, figure out where to go with this. Now, one of the interesting things about Foley is that she also talked about, how it took 3 years to get this to the table, to a vote, because staff members did not consider this to be a priority. So again, when you look at politicians, the good news is you recycle them every 4 years because they are recyclable. They are people who can be recycled. And that's because for the most part, they're just figureheads. The people that are actually doing the work are going to be in city planning. They're going to be somewhere in an agency. They're not going to be your politicians. Your politicians are just figureheads. Now, that even applies in a sense to Jimmy Carter, who didn't realize when he was going for a boycott of the Olympics in protest of Soviet policies that he didn't actually have the authority to do that. And so one of the things that happened was that he had to use his power as a bully pulpit. That's the way the phrase goes. You use your power to bully people when they don't want to do what you want them to do. And that can sometimes be a very good thing. depending on, let's say, if you're Lyndon Johnson trying to get southern states to revise or agree or at least sign on to civil rights legislation, or whatnot. But in this case, it's really interesting because Jimmy Carter won. He won his battle to boycott the Olympics, and that resulted in a tit-for-tat response by the Soviet Union, which then boycotted the Olympics in Los Angeles. And here we are all these years later, and despite the fact that Carter won, got what he wanted, most people agree that it was a poor decision to make. The athletes lost out for no reason other than politics. But it shows you the kind of idealism that Carter had, in the sense that he really believed that the United States and the systems within the United States were worthy of being followed on a moral basis. In other words, the boycott worked in a sense because it showed that the United States was willing to make sacrifices in order to, make sacrifices on principle. And in order to do that, Jimmy Carter would have been the perfect person to do that. Even for today, it's acknowledged that he is one of the most honest people and decent people in the world, who may have managed to do more after his presidency than during it, which is remarkable given how much he actually accomplished in office, including, for example, getting closer to China, negotiating an Egyptian-Israeli peace deal. It's just incredible what he managed to do because of the force, not the force of his character, but the force of his integrity. And so when you listen to these city council members, remember, this is where everyone gets to start, for the most part. You don't see that same sort of heft, that gravitas. And it's because they don't necessarily know what's going on. I'm thinking of two people in particular. One of them is Carrasco, the other one is Arenas. And what was interesting is when Carrasco went off script, she sounded like an idiot. It was just remarkable how unself-aware she was during her monologue in support of strong-arming the head of mental health services, I guess in the state or the city. What does all this have to do with you and me? Well, what it has to do with is understanding that politics matters, but only if it has integrity associated with it. So in other words, you can get things done. If you have somebody in office who is both knowledgeable, involved, and decent and honest. And if you don't have these things, what ends up happening is, you don't really have a political arm that balances out the corporate sector. And then you end up with people pointing fingers at each other and blaming each other about taxes and so on. And then nothing gets done. Or things get done, but only in a superficial way that doesn't really cause much change fundamentally. And so, but the important thing to realize is that when people start pointing fingers at each other, it's important to realize that all the problems that they're talking about could not have happened overnight. They were the culmination of negligence and a lack of integrity within the process and a lack of diplomacy and cooperation. And I call what happened between Maya Esparza and her colleague Foley was diplomacy in action. It was remarkable to watch. And that's what we need more of. You're not going to get there unless you have people who are involved and smart and who want to get things done for their constituents in a way that is respectful of all the interests on the table. The problem is that to the extent that we have these issues, in the United States, one of the issues is fake news. And the reason we have that is not because of something that happened in a presidential election or a local election in 2016, or because of Russian or foreign interference. What's happened is that since the Vietnam War, the Catholic politicians in this country, specifically Joseph McCarthy, have decided to pursue an agenda that favors the Catholic Church, especially its property and its global reach, over domestic policies. And we know that now. We know now that Joseph McCarthy pursued an anti-communist agenda in order to root out within the State Department and everywhere else anyone who was anti-war. And that may have included some Catholics, but for the most part, he was able to reshape the federal government into what we consider to be a traditional Catholic, which is a conservative. And that's what the Catholic Church, of course, has been known for. It's been known to be conservative until recently, when, in my opinion, it has decided to, shift tactics in order to preserve its property and its tax exemption, so as not to be completely unpopular and have its property taken away from it, as was the case in both Mexico and in Europe. And in both cases, I believe the governments eventually returned some of that property, or most of it, back to the Catholic Church. In England, of course, the Catholic Church had to, change itself into the Anglican Church. But most of that property eventually made its way back. The Catholic Church starts out in Vietnam, loses that war, tries to separate North and South Vietnam into a northern Buddhist state and a southern Catholic state. It fails. It completely fails. There's a famous photo of a monk setting himself on fire because of the discrimination that happened under a U.S.-supported regime in South Vietnam that was openly Catholic. The brother of the person that the JFK installed there was the brother of an archbishop. I forget his name, but you can just look it up. Just look up the brother, look up who was in charge in the South Vietnam, and then you'll look up who his brother was in Hue, in the middle of the country, which is probably where might be nearby the DMZ at that time, or so on and so forth. You look at that, and then you go all the way fast forward to Afghanistan. Remember, the United States, since Vietnam, they lost Vietnam, has been in a position where it's continued to lose war after war after war, except for small skirmishes. I believe the Grenada Islands would be one of them. You look at El Salvador, I believe that the communist threat, allowed the United States to interfere in domestic politics. You've got a lot of different issues going on. But you fast forward to Afghanistan, and you've got the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, who attended the school that I went to, Santa Clara University. I went to the law school, and I believe he went to undergrad, or both undergrad as well as law school there. Now, what's interesting is that under Leon Panetta in Afghanistan, what happened was he authorized knowingly a drone civilian, well, obviously we don't call it a drone civilian strike program. They call it a drone, just a drone program under CIA auspices. That in this case had allowed a 9-to-1 civilian to target ratio. In other words, Leon Panetta knowingly signed off or knew about, and this is all public now, that for it was okay morally to take out an entire mosque on a Friday, for example, as long as you got your target. If you got a couple of targets in there, it didn't matter if you killed women and children. And again, Leon Panetta, devout Catholic. Says in the documentary called The Spy Masters, he says, I'll let God judge me. You look at that trajectory, and you can also see it's not just the money that prevents another Jimmy Carter. It's a lack of integrity that's associated with a lack of principles. So that's why the anti-war movement has been, for the most part, based on a principle, not just of humanity, but of a cohesive society. Because once you start openly killing people who are civilians, you tear the bond between humanity that is necessary to have integrity. You could never imagine Jimmy Carter saying anything like that or authorizing anything like that. And he had a chance to do so, by the way. He was told during the hostage crisis in Iran that the United States military could invade and take over, but it would cost, I believe, hundreds of American lives and tens of thousands of Iranian lives. He declined. And he got all the hostages out of that country by way of Germany before the next administration came in. And the next administration was Ronald Reagan. It was not a member of his political party, but Jimmy Carter was so incredible that he wanted to make sure that the incoming administration had a clean slate to begin. Really can't imagine these sorts of things happening in the United States political scheme today. And so the key issue to remember here is that when you've got a witch hunt In many cases, whoever is being called names is being called names in an effort to remove their influence from some political branch or division in order to make way for someone else. And in this case, you have to look past the name calling. You know, when Joseph McCarthy called somebody a communist, you know, he had to keep going, because once he removed all of the known communists, and there's almost always a grain of truth, by the way, to the accusations. There were people who were part of the Communist Party passing on state secrets to the Soviet Union, who were working as, probably all over the place, particularly with respect to atomic energy or scientific research regarding an atomic bomb. It's absolutely the case also that there is a grain of truth and a threat somewhere that allows these politicians, regardless of political party or religion, to get on the pulpit and decide that everyone associated with that religion or race or political party is a threat and must be surveilled, and so on and so forth. That happens everywhere. If you're in Turkey, it happened with the Armenians. If you're in the United States, it happened with the Japanese. It happened with the Japanese internment camps, even when a personal spy close to FDR even told him there's no evidence of Japanese-American disloyalty. So FDR, in order to create a check and balance on existing, intelligence, had his own spy that had a cover as a journalist who had more accurate information, single-handedly, than the other sources that were feeding FDR. That man says to FDR, no threat from Japanese Americans. This disloyalty stuff, it's all something that allows the military-industrial complex to beat the war drums, to make itself bigger, or I guess too big to fail. Obviously, those exact words were not used. And here we are. The military in this country is, in fact, too big to fail. The Catholic Church has, as a result of using the communist scare to remove political opposition and, for the most part, an overlap between non-Catholics and communists, or anybody really at that point that was not Catholic, has taken over a majority of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House, the presidency. We can, in San Jose, obviously, or even back then, you go back to the 1968 Democratic Convention, you've got a Democratic mayor, Daley, beating the crap out of anti-war protesters right outside the convention. So the Democratic Party in this country, despite its new face, has always been, since Vietnam, a subsidiary of the Catholic Church. It's always been, since Vietnam, pro-war. So when people say, why didn't the liberals in this country speak out against the Iraq War? Why didn't they protest? It's because they've always been pro-war in order to maintain existing advantages. It's always been the case. So the main point here is, if you're looking to the Democratic Party for liberalism, for anti-war activity, you're not going to find it there. It's a cover that's designed to remove the truth of what I just told you, which is the Catholic Church has always been pro-war. Starting from Vietnam, the minute that it got political power, it tried to separate Vietnam into North and South. Afghanistan, it's 9-to-1 civilian kill ratio under the CIA, remember, not the military, under the CIA that was run by Leon Panetta. You go back and forth, and now the question is, what's going to happen in Russia under a so-called liberal, democratic, Catholic president? And you can hear the war drums beating again. And you know it's not good for anybody. But I think that there's some hope, because the real problem here is, what do you do if you are in the United States? It's fairly obvious that over the next 40 years, the United States, because of its absence of political integrity, is going to decline. Relative to China, Russia, and a lot of other countries, not necessarily because those countries are going to be better than the United States in 40 years, though they might, but simply because of colonization. They're starting from such a low level that there's almost nowhere to go but up once you remove for example, the British administration of Hong Kong, and you return that to China. So what's going to happen in the future is that in this country, you have to understand that it's hard to teach the truth, because if you have a Catholic government, local, state, and federal, the governor of California is also Catholic, there's no incentive to teach people history properly if it makes the religion and the church that's backing them into a warmongering party. You can't win. So you have to have propaganda. So when I say the United States is going to decline, I'm talking about that on a relative basis. And that's important because it matters if you live in a country that literally cannot tell the truth unless it wants to have political revolution. And it matters because it's now up against other countries that, because they were colonized, can tell the truth and maintain credibility. So China can always say, whatever happened in Hong Kong was not our fault. It was the fault of the British. Whatever happened in Macau was not our fault. It was the fault of the Portuguese. The Malaysians can say the same thing. Whatever happened here with the racial riots was a product of British occupation, or if you're Singapore, of Japanese occupation. So it doesn't really matter where you go. There's always been this idea that might makes right in a way that has created the need for propaganda in order to maintain political power. And the sad thing about that is, of course, that the truth is the first thing to die before war. But in this case, it doesn't look like it can be unburied. At least not if the existing political structures are to remain in place. So what actually has to happen in this country in order to move forward is a second Protestant Reformation. And I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic about any sort of second Protestant Reformation. Because for the most part, if you can issue debt, now this country now runs on debt, doesn't run on taxes, which is another way of saying that it runs on the military and the bank, the military and the financial sector, which are always looking to expand. It's another problem, right, when you have a lack of honest politicians. But I am optimistic about other countries simply because they're going to be able to tell the truth and still maintain political and social cohesion, even if they've got the same problems. Malaysia has the same problems of segregation as the United States because of colonization, not because of slavery, but because chattel slavery, or the split between the Protestants and the Catholics, but the effect is almost the same. And it's even worse in some cases, because if you try to look at the solutions that a country like Malaysia tried to enact after colonization in order to support people that were formerly victimized, they've instituted a lot of things that don't make much sense today as more and more people mix, as segregation is reduced. And right now in Malaysia, even now in the year 2022, right now, if you are to apply for a government program, like even an ID card, you have to say what race you are. Malay, Indian, and there's even different categories for Malaysians from Sarawak and I believe Sabah, because those have always been two almost autonomous provinces. Sarawak because of the oil and its expertise in oil and so on. But you can see that, and then you have others and so on, but your rights to government jobs within Malaysia are dependent in part on which box you're allowed to check. And again, if you think that's strange, just remember in this country, because of affirmative action, and again, the same principle of trying to correct historical wrongs, if you mark a box Native American, the same principle applies, that you do have a preference for a government job. It's just that other countries in Asia are less wishy-washy about it and simply have quotas. They don't have this idea of allowing the lawyers to come in so much in order to modify what the executive branch wants done. So what I'm trying to say is that this miasma that we're looking at all over the world is not restricted to the United States. It's all over the world because of war And because of the fact that we have religion that used to be a check and balance on separating human beings. In other words, it was used to be an idea that allowed us to bring people together regardless of race and religion, of race and socioeconomic background. And once you change that, what's left? The government in this country particularly, is almost feckless when it comes to helping the poor. And as a result has allowed not just, especially the Catholic Church, to use its quote-unquote social welfare programs in order to create more influence in many places in the United States. And then use that influence to leverage itself into positions of political power. And so what I like to say is that the Catholic Church in this country, and not just in this country, all over the world, has made poverty into a business. On the city council call, there's this idea that we have a homelessness problem here in San Jose, and we do. The rents here are too high for what they offer. And so one of the solutions is building housing. Well, one of the council members pointed out that building a house or a dwelling costs taxpayers $850,000. You can imagine if you have a majority Catholic city council, you can imagine where that money is going to go. Even if it's to an honest developer, right? It's going to go within the same system of people who know each other. And it's the same thing that happens all over the world, right? If you go to China, the same system happens. The money was distributed to people who are in the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It's just that China has never argued that it's a diverse nation that's a leader in human rights or in principles or universal principles. It's trying to get there. You look at its plan, its 10, 20, 30-year plan. I haven't seen the 20-year plan. It's trying to get there, actually, in a spirit of cooperation and so on and so forth. But you notice that that's actually where we have to go. We have to get back to universal principles. How are we going to get there if the movements that are actually trying to get us there towards a spirit of universality, how are we going to get there if they're almost always minority religions, like, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mennonites or the Amish, or in the United States, could be the Muslims, who are about 2% of the population. The best politicians in this country are, one of them is Ron Wyden. He has a Jewish background. A lot of the best politicians in this country are Jewish, right? But they're only about 2 to 4% of the population. So you look at, again, look at a lot of walls being built all around us, that are propped up by vested interests. And because of all the debt that's holding up those vested interests, you can buy up anybody you want until you're left with a small minority that within a democratic system cannot get things done. At least not on principle. And this is not religion, it's human nature. If you want to teach somebody a principle, you're going to lose if the guy next to you decides to argue against you and pay the other person $5 or $10 or whatever that number is now in order to disagree with you. That's also the reason, by the way, that we have so much conflict online and social media. We have a lot of actors involved in that situation. To me, that just means you have to bolster your nonprofit journalism sector, but you also have to create talent first. You can't have talent without having integrity. The political branch has not only been a check and balance on excessive religious or other institutional power, whether corporate or otherwise. It's been, again, a place where a Jimmy Carter or a Bernie Sanders could start and get that training necessary, like a Maya Esparza or a Pam Foley, to move on up and actually start to figure out all these different issues, regardless of their background, racially or religiously. So if you cut that off, and you're left with a bunch of figureheads in a country that's mired in debt, you can see why I'm more optimistic about colonized countries, including India, doing better than a developed country or a highly developed country like the United States. Now, what about the EU? What's interesting is the EU is doing a good job. It's, when you look at this country, It's hard to look at or believe anybody in power now, whether it's a teacher or a politician. You study your civics class, and you're taught that, what are you taught? You're taught that there's privacy in the Constitution, that we have a right to privacy. And then you go online and you realize that even though you have the FISA court, you've got the NSA, and then that's just on the governmental side of it. On top of that, you've got the private sector cybersecurity organizations, and that means that you're really going to have an honest government in order to operate as a check and balance on the private sector. In other words, the NSA has to be the most honest man or woman or entity in the room. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a bunch of fragmented security structures that eventually reduce governmental influence. We're just going in circles, right? We're going right back to integrity. We're going back to a Jimmy Carter situation, and then here's the problem, right? It's hard to get another Jimmy Carter, right? Because of the cost, because of the vested interests. You can't win the presidency on millions of dollars anymore. So what happens when you have a country running on debt rather than taxes, and the banks are running things, and the military is running things, and they always get paid, and they make sure they always get paid, and the debt gets paid? What happens? You don't need politicians anymore. You can make them into jokes, right? Because they're no longer useful other than as figureheads. And that's not what countries that have executive-led models believe. If you're Xi in China, or Putin in Russia, or Li in Singapore, you don't believe any of what I just said. What you believe is that you can make a difference, and as long as you have social cohesion, and as long as you're able to do what you say. And the principle is not going to be morality that gets the country there. It's going to be practicality. And the Singaporeans, the most successful political system in the world right now, will tell you that they're not based on a moral principle. They're based on the principle of flexibility and practicality. Maybe that's a good place to start, and then we can get to the higher level of universal principles.